the whole reason I like this rewrite ultimately better than the original Hobbit is that the character of Middle-earth is more clear in this story, in the way that he writes this.
Before the Rings of Power, there were the Silmarils. Before Sauron, there was his master Morgoth. Before Aragorn and Arwen, there was Beren and Luthien. Join us as we explore Tolkien and all the ages of Middle-earth with your hosts from theonering.com, Jonathan Watson and Michael Grumbine.
Michael, we took a long break between our chapter 3 and 3.5 of The Hobbit to talk about the Rings of Power and all the changes they made. But what we're going to talk about this week is all the changes Tolkien made to chapter 3 of The Hobbit.
The only I shouldn't say that. Oh, okay, I have a joke for the I have a joke for the subscriber section, which I will say, but not on the main section. But yes, Tolkien. Tolkien didn't publish. He just to recap, because I know our longtime listeners will know this, but in case people are picking this up for the first time, in 1960 or so, he thought about rewriting The Hobbit, and in fact, he did end up. Did I mess up already? You said nope. Okay. So he went to start a rewrite, and this is, of course, a few years after the publication of Lord of the Rings. And so he is bringing The Hobbit more in line with Lord of the Rings. And we've talked before about how generally it's a darker flavor. It's more detail oriented. It's more mature. We're going to go into some of those details today. But he cut bait after the third chapter on this, and he had some notes about what he was going to do later on. But he essentially abandoned it. And so the version that everyone ends up reading, which was 6 years later, which we all know as The Hobbit, 1966 version, which has Gandalf as Gandalf, not Bloodorthan like he was in 1935, etc. And Gandalf was in 35 is now Thorin. And so all the things we're familiar with regard to The Hobbit that Peter Jackson decided to trash in his Hobbit movies, that we know and love about The Hobbit. We know and love them from the 1966 version.
That's right.
And so Tolkien had abandoned. So it's very interesting. I'd love to maybe talk, if not this episode, next episode, or later down the line, of what we think about in general. Why did Tolkien not do the rewrite? Why did he not make it more like Lord of the Rings and left it more like a children's tale? So anyway, things for people to think about. But this time we are covering the arrival in Rivendell, as the new chapter is called, which is the third chapter of The Hobbit. And in the Hobbit version that we're all familiar with, it's is it just Rivendell, or is it the Last Homely House?
The Last Homely House, I think.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Maybe I don't have it pulled up in front of me.
It's called Arrival in Rivendell in the new.
Right, Arrival in Rivendell. Yep, that's what I mentioned for the new one. Yeah. And then in the very first version, 1935, it's just called Rivendell. And I can't remember what it's called in the 66 version. Now I'm all mixed up because we've been
short rest. It's called a short rest.
Okay. Yeah. So yeah, it's crazy because
it is
now that you and I are bouncing back and forth between 3 different versions of The Hobbit.
I know, it's so hard. It is the one that it's almost even like 4, because he had the names like Bloodorthan and Thorin. Those were there until like he changed them when he did publish them in 37, right? Is that one the first one? But it was there. He kept those names for so long up until the very end, it seemed like. And then he came in and he rewrote. Anyway, we'll get to all the details, and we're going to talk about at the end of this here. We're going to talk about what are our general thoughts about the rewrite. And there is a note here, and I'm not sure if you caught that, because it was in all the details sort of after this after chapter thing where the author gave a bunch of details about it, where Christopher Tolkien did point out at what point Tolkien, his father, did give up writing this version of The Hobbit and what the event was before that. So we'll talk about that at the very end. And then also in our extended podcast, which is available for our subscribers, our members, which you can get to by going to theonering.com/member. Thanks to Lynn and Rich for being sponsors instead of just members, but it's $4 a month. The first month is free. We're going to talk about what is the least Middle-earth-like, Lord of the Rings-like event in The Hobbit, because Tolkien was trying to take The Hobbit and bring it into the same narrative feel, the same world-like feel of the Lord of the Rings. with this rewrite, but then he gave up.
Yeah, the abortive rewrite, right?
And so he was clearly doing that with the way he handled the trolls, with the way he handled their journey in general, with how the hobbits spoke, with the way he changed his prose style. But now we're left with just the original Hobbit without all that. But we're going to go over that this episode, and talk about what is the least Lord of the Rings like event. So get that by becoming a member. Get to theonering.com/member or theonering.com/Patreon. And join our Discord then too, where you can ask questions that we will endeavor to answer whenever you post them. But this week was also sort of a sad week because the final Hildebrandt brother, one of the Tolkien artists, passed away at the age of 85. Greg Hildebrandt, his brother Tim, his twin brother, actually Tim, they were both born in 1939. Passed away, I think it was 18 years ago, 2006, 2008. And so he passed away. And you got to remember, like, so many people have a certain look and feel that they apply to Tolkien's works, and it's based on what Peter Jackson did, right? That is the visual language that's been created around it now, and it's really hard for people to get out of it. That's why I appreciate things like Ted Naismith. I mean, I will say Peter Jackson was based a lot of his on Alan Lee and John Howe too. So it's not like he didn't base it on other artists. But the Hildebrandt brothers were really the first ones. In 1976, they made the Tolkien calendar, and their style. I don't know, what would you say it is? It's very medieval. It's not very Middle Earth, maybe.
Do we have examples of the pictures? Because
so this is a year, right? Silmarillion, I just want to make sure. Silmarillion was published in September 77. So this was a year before the Silmarillion. And so not all these photos are from this calendar, but this was the very first one that they did. I thought an appropriate photo to bring up would be this one here, which is the dwarves and Bilbo, the dwarves with all their instruments. And this is a later photo. This isn't from 1976. I'll show you a couple of those in a second. And if you're listening to the podcast, I'll link all these in the show notes. But I mean, there's so much detail in here. I don't know if you can see it, but it's with the clock and the smoke and the different types of smoke. And you've got the flutes and the violins and the harps and the drums and the food. And there's so much going on here. The shadows of the way the fire is casting the shadows on everything. I don't know. Really beautiful. A lot of people, it's controversial. A lot of people don't like their style at all. And I'll show you here, for example, one of these here. This was in the original calendar. This is the City of the Nazgul, I believe it was called. And the golem here is pretty I don't know,
monstrous. He's pretty monstrous.
Yeah, there you go. And
he looks like essentially like a troll, like a small troll.
Yeah, and you can see there's even like this weird troll face that they stuck. He's for some reason right over here on the left hand side. Not sure, like that's definitely a face of some sort. You got the Watchers right here. Yeah. Anyway,
it really reminds me of older fairy tale styles. I think it was like there's a bit of sort of the attempt to do realistic, kind of hazy Renaissance style detail. But along with that, the proportions are very fairy tale like some things are just bigger than they should be and smaller than they should be. And but it is, and perspective is often interesting. Although this one you were just looking at, I actually kind of like the perspective of the Theoden. I don't know if that's Theoden. It's supposed to be Theoden.
No, that's Eowyn.
No, Theoden on the ground in front of us in the foreground.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
Oh no, it's just a rider of Rohan. I think.
Yeah, it is. I don't think it's Theoden.
Because the horse would have been on Theoden. But anyway, it's just very. It's very, like, look at the fell beast, and you look at the way people interact, and the dwarves interact with each other, like the dress, how the dwarves dress, the proportions of the hobbits' feet, they're ridiculously large. They're not even.
That's true. Yeah, this one was in that calendar originally too.
Yep, but it's kind of an interesting style. I mean, it's got a cleanliness to it that is that and a detail, and it's very detail oriented. It does remind me of the Raphaelite school, but with a different overall motif, a more fairy tale motif. So anyway, I found that I grew up seeing the Hildebrandt's versions. I was born in the early 70s, and so I this was the first art that I really saw of Lord of the Rings was the Hildebrandt, and there were aspects of it I really like the use of light and warmth is really interesting and actually very rich, and maybe it appealed to me as a child too, but you can feel the smoke in this picture, and the detail of the instruments, as you mentioned before, is and the faces. He does not shy away from faces, and they did not shy away from faces, and they did a great job. So it's a loss that the last one died.
Yeah, well, the other thing that if you've perhaps their most famous painting for modern culture would be this of Star Wars. We've all probably seen this original Star Wars poster, which has Leia with a crazy long calf for some reason, but not exactly the style of Star Wars when you will go and see Star Wars. But they injected their own style into it, and it was a hit. This picture of the huge Darth Vader mask in the background. And they definitely had a style, right? That style, like even you look at the facial structure and the way that they drew characters was very similar still in how they did them, in these shots here. So they definitely had their style. I will say the one place where I was most familiar with them, maybe the first time I really recognized them, because my first Tolkien calendar was a Naismith calendar, I believe, and so that's what I really started. And then Hildebrandt was sort of after becoming a bigger fan of Tolkien. Do you know what this is from? This picture of it looks like elves and dwarves and humans and a wizard in the background.
Yeah, I know what this is from. This is the Shannara series.
It is the Sword of Shannara, the biggest copy of the Lord of the Rings without it being any good. But you could almost like transplant these characters right into the Lord of the Rings and their paintings back and forth. But he did all the Shannara stuff from Terry Brooks.
Yep.
Financially successful series, which I still disliked a lot. But anyway, he passed away. It's a sad thing. I look at so much of the fan art that's out today, and I hate that it's all derivative. It's all derivative of Peter Jackson's films now. There's very little, not all. It is dramatically high in the derivative aspect of this here. There's very few people who will actually go out and create their own visual look and feel for the characters even, or for the Balrog in particular, or for how Sauron looks in his helm, right? All that is very derivative of Peter Jackson. So I appreciate that they had their own style and they injected it into The Lord of the Rings. And we are the richer for it, for having somebody else kind of give us a vision of what it looked like.
I agree. And that's why I like Naismith. And I like the Hildebrandt. They're not my preferred style in terms of what my mind's eye created, but they like you said. Let me put it a different way. An imaginative work of literature like Tolkien's deserves to have a number of hands at the brush, because the way we picture an imaginative work of fiction is different person by person in our heads. And so seeing a different variety of images and feel to it, and avoiding what becomes a sort of monolithic art approach, which is due to, like you said, the Jackson movies. Now, I'm going to say something nice about the Jackson movies in that regard. They would not have been so monolithic in the world of art if they had not been done well. So if he had, for example, I give you the Bakshi version of the Ralph Bakshi version of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and that had an art style all its own, and I'm glad it has died and no one tries to reproduce it. It'll sometimes come out in memes and stuff, but it's not good. It's just not good.
Yeah, you're totally right. That without quality, it wouldn't be successful. I'm just sad because what it does is it adds a screen in front of your your sub-creation, if you know what I mean. When you read it, right, you start seeing things in that way. And I wish we'd have our own mind's eye. Somehow we could wipe it clean for a reading of the Lord of the Rings and come to
I
it
agree with
fresh.
you. You know what's a weird silver lining though? I was thinking about The Hunt for Gollum that we were talking about last week, and I was thinking that one of the silver linings related to what we were just talking about here with regard to different art styles is that I know Ian McKellen is going to be Gandalf, and Gollum will still look like the Gollum from Peter Jackson. But as you get more and more versions of Lord of the Rings done by different entities, there's going to be a different guy playing Aragorn, for example. It's not going to be Viggo Mortensen, and there's going to be other.
Are you sure?
characters.
I'm pretty sure it's going to be Viggo Mortensen playing Aragorn. I thought they said they'd have him.
Really? Are they going to de-age him or what? Oh
sure.
No! I take back my silver lining. It all sucks. I was going to say once you start having, eventually you have to start having different characters because the actors die. So as that happens, that expands the imaginative spectrum of the way you can imagine different characters. So as time goes on, there will be, I think, the hold that the Jackson films have on the characters and the way they look is going to lessen. I don't know if it'll ever go away. It's such a landmark, but I think it's going to lessen. So anyway,
you're probably right.
But if they're still bringing back Viggo to play Aragorn, then screw that. I don't.
I'm pretty sure like he's open to it. I don't know if it's been officialized that he's in it. I'm pretty sure that people would they'd throw a fit if he wasn't in it. More to come though. I'm sure that will be released after War of the Rohirrim is out.
All right, back to real Tolkien.
All right, so we're going to get into this chapter 3. Before we do, every week. Oh wait, hey, subscribe and click the little thumbs up button below, the like button, guys.
Please
Appreciate
do.
it. Yeah, we'd love you more. More people find us, more conversations get better, the information gets bigger. Everything is more wonderful when you click the like button.
Everything is awesome.
You know what else is wonderful? It's today's
Hobbit Facts.
All right, today's Hobbit fact. Guys, did you know that J.R.R. Tolkien typed out The Hobbit using a typewriter on his bed? So he would sit there on his bed using a typewriter. I don't know. He was he was about 40 years old at the time. So you can see him sitting there cross-legged on a typewriter on his bed. This is what he wrote in a letter to Christopher Bretherton on July 16th, 1964. I'm not sure who Christopher Bretherton is. I did some research on it. I couldn't figure out exactly who this gentleman was, but he wrote him a number of letters. Here's what he wrote. I do not regard typing as a discourtesy. Anyway, I usually type since my hand tends to start fairly, my hand meaning my handwriting, tends to start fair and rapidly fall away into picturesque inscrutability. Like it's true. His writing is picturesque, but it's completely inscrutable once you get down to it. Also, I like typewriters, and my dream is of suddenly finding myself rich enough. Remember, 64, The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings was not exactly like huge yet. Finding myself rich enough to have an electric typewriter built to my specifications to type the Feanorian script. He wanted a typewriter for the Feanorian script. Like, what could he do with a computer now, right?
Oh, that's awesome.
Then he said this, I typed out The Hobbit and the whole of The Lord of the Rings twice and several sections many times on my bed in an attic of Manor Road. In the dark days between the loss of my large house in North Oxford, which I could no longer afford, and my brief elevation to the dignity of an old college house in Holywell. So one, he wanted a typewriter with a Feanorian script. He would have loved fonts, man. Imagine him going nuts now. He would have probably rewritten The Hobbit written The Hobbit, The Lord of the Rings in a Feanorian script the entire way.
Absolutely.
Man. This is why we need cryogenics. This is why we need people to be able to live forever, because the one person that should have been able to finish The Lord of the Rings, we need to, anyway. I
think he objects to that idea.
I think so too. So there you have it. He sat cross-legged or in some way or another on his bed writing The Hobbit on a typewriter.
That's awesome.
All right. Chapter 3, Arrival in Rivendell. And this is relatively brief compared to the other two rewrites that we talked about a number of episodes ago. There's only like 9 or 10 longer paragraphs that he put into this here. And It really follows on, I think, what we talked about in the chapter 2 rewrite. And that's really one of the things is I think there's more clarity about time, where he's really clear about like on the fourth day from the bridge is one of the words that he uses. And there's also more details to the world again, right? There's more creativity when it comes to his describing the world. Is that what you found in this here? Or was there anything more specific that in rereading these sections that you found?
No, I agree with you. I found what we mentioned last time, which is more detail about the land. But in this specific rewrite, he's writing mostly about, this is just to be clear, his rewrite only covers the time until they enter Rivendell. It does not cover. It does not cover their interactions with Elrond or even the singing of the elves. So it's just the first half, essentially, of the Rivendell chapter in The Hobbit, and that he does make some notes about what he would like to do in that second, to add into that second half of the chapter. We can cover them in a second. But in the half that we have, I found, you mentioned on the fourth day from the bridge, and then it says in the afternoon of the next day they came to the river, and then it was so, and then he talks about what times of day things happen in as well. And so the next day, he talks about the moonless night and the next day, when they're looking for the path to Rivendell. And so he's very chronologically aware in this rewrite as before. And you pointed out that there are some notes that go into great detail. And I don't know if we want to talk about it now, but before we do that, let me just mention, from the first sentence, you see a difference in tone than the first sentence of the chapter in the original Hobbit. They felt that danger was lurking on both sides of their road. They camped where they could and set watches. Now, this is where's the danger coming from? Like they've beaten the trolls. This is danger injected by Tolkien because the world is a darker place in The Lord of the Rings than it is in The Hobbit. The Hobbit has danger in it, but it's childlike danger. It's fairy tale danger. It's, you go from one episode to another and there's going to be some danger, but it's not as if the world around you is a character in the story, the way the world is definitely a character in Tolkien's Lord of the Rings. And so I found that interesting from the first sentence, the danger part. But then you were pointing out, when it came to the time, that he in fact was very particular about both distance and time. In fact, even writing a journal of Bilbo's journey day by day on what happened from, I guess, April 28th to May 24th, right?
Yeah. So real fast, there is in the second sentence of The Hobbit in the original one in the short rest is they had begun to feel that danger was not far away on either side. So they do mention danger.
Oh, I missed that.
But
forget that part then.
But the whole thing is like they felt that danger was lurking on both sides of the roads. One, he gets rid of the passive voice. Right? They had begun to feel. Ugh. And he writes, they felt, and then he uses the word lurking. So there's more of an incisive idea of danger. And they camped where they could, and they set watches. And here they don't actually set watches, right? And so the actions that they take reveal the danger as well. In addition to that, and that's part of the whole reason I like this rewrite ultimately better than the original Hobbit, even though it was abandoned, is that the character of Middle Earth is more clear in this story, in the way that he writes this. And that goes into the point you were making about he had let me get that right. He wrote 2 sheets of single-spaced typewritten paper that went over the day-by-day details of Bilbo's first journey. And so I'm going to read the very first entry he has of this. And this goes to his detail-orientedness, right? He talked about how he hated doing maps because it took him so much time to make everything work right. But this here, when he wrote, he had to make sure everything worked together, that where they went made sense. They couldn't go from Eregion to Moria in an afternoon. There was too long. They went, I think he said they went about an average of 16 miles a day, which isn't very far, but because they were they didn't go, they weren't urgent.
16 miles a day is not bad over rough country.
He wrote, They average 16 miles a day. It's slow, but accounted for by a leisurely pace at the beginning and slow progress in the wilds, especially before passing the Gray Flood.
Right. I guess in the beginning they had a
So,
road, and
yeah.
then they were going through the wilds.
Yeah. So here's what he wrote on the very first day of April 28th. And I love the detail. I love the names he gives everything now. And I love that, like, he doesn't, and he talks about the things that are happening and the little people and how everything, all the details that make the world real. And man, I wish this was in the book. All right. So here's what he wrote. April 1st, or April 28th for day one, April 28th. Spend night at the All Welcome Inn at junction of the North Way and East Road on Hobbiton side of Frogmorton, so called because much used by the travelers through the Shire, especially by dwarves on the way to Thorn's home in exile, which was in the west side of the Blue Mountains, the southern part in Harlenden. None of this is mentioned in the text, but the All Welcome Inn, right, that's capitalized, A-L-L, A is capitalized, the All Welcome Inn, so that's the name of the place, should be marked on the needed Shire map in any new edition of The Hobbit. It has to be remembered that the East Road, though it ran through the Shire, was not the property of the Hobbits. It was an ancient royal road, and they maintained the traditional duty of keeping it in repair and providing hospitality for travelers. This was, of course, profitable. It also provided their chief source of outside news. Dwarves were therefore not a rare sight on the East Road or in its inns. It would also appear that they were sometimes employed as road menders and bridge repairers. Right? That's cool. But they seldom turned off it, and their appearance in a company in Bywater and Hobbiton must have caused a lot of talk. They cared very little about hobbits and had little to do with them, except as a source of food in exchange for metal or sometimes forged articles, knives, plowshares, arrowheads, axe heads, and the like. The poorer sort, or Thorn's folk in their earlier time of poverty, might accept employment as masons and road makers, for example, but they had the notion that hobbits were a slow, stupid folk with few artifacts and simple-minded, because the hobbits were generous, never haggled, and gave what was asked. And then April 2nd, or April 29th, the next day was Night at Whitfurrows.
That's it.
That's all.
3 words. After that,
3 words.
After that, huge. I love that too, because he's not just telling you what happened on that day. He tells you what happened on April 28th, and then his mind expands and he begins building his world.
Yes. Yeah.
And it gets into both place and into the attitudes of the races towards each other, into economy and what happened. This is why I have no patience, though he is a great writer from a talent perspective, with comments like George R.R. Martin's about how he doesn't like Tolkien because Tolkien didn't care about politics. You see a passage like this, and you can tell that Tolkien's mind cares. Like, he talks about the economics of things, how this was, they traveled on this road and not through Bywater, and it was maintained, and the dwarves sometimes did the mending, and so they got, if they were poor, or, but then they didn't care so much for the hobbits, or they thought the hobbits were slow, stupid people because they wouldn't haggle the way dwarves, and the implication is that dwarves were shrewd businessmen and they haggled for their goods and wares. And so there's all kinds of detail that Tolkien's clearly telling us about. It's just that when you get to the Lord of the Rings, just like with the Fëanorian episodes and the all the way to the fall of Gondolin and the Eärendil adventures and Luthien and Beren and Luthien, and Tolkien won't give us all the details, but they're all in his head because he's building a real world. So the economics, for example, of the roads through the Shire is something he thought about. And he put that, and it was important to him. It just wasn't important enough to wax on about it in the book itself because it's background.
But those little notes of that they would trade knives, plowshares, axe heads, and the like. Those would reveal themselves if he would have continued this in how they interact. And Bilbo's saying my axe head has gone dull. And Thorin or one of the dwarves would say, well, maybe if you would have been there the day we were trading, little things like that, that at some point there could have been a hint back to it, which you see, I think, once things are more fleshed out in the Lord of the Rings and how people interact and what they think. And I love that he doesn't just say they didn't get along, right? They didn't get along because he thought they were slow, stupid folk with few artifacts and simple-minded because the hobbits were generous and never haggled. It's the opposite of what so many writers do today, where they'll tell us exactly what somebody thinks about it without actually explaining why, or even better, they
Without
never
showing us.
explain why. Yeah, they never show us why. Whereas a writer like Tolkien would always show us why. And here he's giving himself the reminder that, like, here, show this part. Show them that they never haggled and they were
Right.
simple-minded if it ever comes to that
Right.
point.
I agree that there's something lost. So let's, there's another detail that he meant. So he puts a note in at the end for the end of this chapter at a point, parts that he never rewrote explicitly. But he says, for example, chapter 3 should make clear Elrond's care for roads, etc., from the Grey Flood to whatever mountains. Also insert the white horse Rohald belonged to Rivendell and had been lent by Elrond to Gandalf. So Rohald, if you remember from our episode a couple months ago about this, was Gandalf's horse in this rewrite, which he then doesn't have after Rivendell. And so Tolkien's giving you the reason for why he doesn't have it after Rivendell. And it's so he's going, and also the care for the roads again, like your text about the care for the roads through the Shire. Tolkien's talking about, well, how do roads don't just care for themselves. Somebody has to take care of them if they're going to be cared for. And so he's going to make sure that it's pointed out that Elrond actually, manages infrastructure. He isn't just concerned with moonletters. So
the chapter ends with, first of all, Rohald. What a loss not having him in the rewrite was.
Exactly.
It would have been another name for a horse in one of my video games. I could have named my horse in Red Dead Redemption Rohald. That would have been wonderful. Because everybody else always does Shadowfax.
Right.
Yeah. So it ends here. I'll read the final. So two things. One, I just like this one phrase that he did not put into the story, but is indicative of his prose and how he creates the world in small things. He writes this: white moths were fluttering in the winds and long heather, and twilight deepened like a mist about the horse's feet. I just love that, right? It subcreates the world around you as you're reading it. I'm not sure what a whin is. It's a heather, a tough prickly shrub more commonly known as furze that grows in European wastelands. Okay, there you go. So white moths were fluttering in the winds and long heather, and twilight deepened like a mist about the horse's feet. And it gives you this counterpoint of these white moths fluttering, but yet it's darkening, and you still see these points of white light moving around as you look off into the distance. I don't know. I love that. Right. The great prose to me is like cool water on a summer's day. Right. It just is so nice. It feels so good. And that line stuck out to me.
And his brevity. I love the end of that sentence. Twilight deepened like a mist about the horse's feet. No one talks about twilight as a localized phenomenon where it's in one place and not the other, but he's talking about the twilight around the horse's feet. So it's almost like the ground gets darker before the sky gets darker. And I love it. It's just
and he didn't say that. He didn't say the ground was getting darker before the sky got darker. He just wrote the twilight deepened around the horse's feet.
Painted it in a few words, which is wonderful.
Yeah, and I must point out, the author of this History of the Hobbit, he actually pointed out, he's like, Tolkien kind of forgot to make a fix here, which was they didn't have horses, they had ponies, and only Gandalf would have had a horse. So when twilight deepened about the horse's feet and the other places he mentions horses, they didn't have horses, they had ponies. So I thought that was interesting. I'm like, oh yeah, that's a good point. And he could have corrected that in the 1966 edition of The Hobbit. Didn't do that either, where it says horses a couple times instead of ponies.
Yeah, the 1966 version, I've often it's in great interest to me that there were a lot of still like little mistakes that he left in. He put a lot of thought into some of the changes, but then there were a bunch of things that he would just, from a sake of, I mean, fair enough, right? If you look at any fantasy writers' writings, and if people went through them page by page with a fine-tooth comb, the way people go through Tolkien with a fine-tooth comb, I'm sure we'd find plenty of mistakes.
True.
As well. It's just that Tolkien is such a towering figure in the world of fiction that everyone is concerned. Not everyone, but so many people are concerned with the particulars. But it is interesting to me that there are some things like that he didn't fix in the 1966 version. So
let's talk then about why he stopped right here. Okay. Why did he stop at "Here it is at last," cried Gandalf as the dwarves came up and stared over the edge. And this was the line in the published version of The Hobbit. "Here it is at last," he called, and the others gathered round him and looked over the edge. and this is the point where the elves come in, singing and tormenting the hobbits and the dwarves.
Teasing.
The hobbit teasing, yeah, and a little bit of torment there.
Tormenting is cruel. I don't think they're cruel. I think they're just being whimsical,
mischievous
fairy story elves.
Yeah. So why do you think he stopped at this point? If like, so my thought is like, okay, he came to the elves and he's like, wow, these elves are so different than the elves that I wrote.
That's what I would have presumed, but I don't know the reason, so I'm going to have to. I would have presumed it was the elves themselves, and he's realizing that his rewrite's going to have to be so different.
I think so too. That this is the point at which, and this is what we'll talk about the extended podcast, thornring.com/member. That we'll like what is the least Tolkien-like thing, and or sorry, at least Lord of the Rings / Silmarillion / Middle Earth / graduated Tolkien prose type of thing that you see in The Hobbit. We'll talk about that extended podcast. This is something that that Christopher Tolkien mentioned in one of the books. I'm not sure which one. I don't have the note here, but here's what he wrote. In the author of the History of the Hobbit, he wrote, according to Christopher Tolkien, when his father had reached this point, this ending point of the middle part of chapter 3, in the recasting, he loaned the material to a friend to get an outside opinion on it. We do not know this person's identity, but apparently her response was something along the lines of, "This is wonderful, but it's not The Hobbit." And that's when he stopped. So he got some feedback where they said, you know what? And I can see that it's the Hobbit and the Dragon. It's not just The Hobbit anymore. It's not just the children's fairy story that he wrote. It's something much greater ultimately, and it feels much more adult than what we knew as The Hobbit. Like we said, it lost some of the charm. In chapter 1 in particular, you lost some of the charm in the way that he shifted things, which I would accept if he would have finished it, if he would have done the whole thing in the new style. But reading that, I think you did lose some of the wonder that was in the original edition of The Hobbit when he rewrote chapter 1, which is his most complete rewrite of the chapter. Chapter 2 was a little bit less, and chapter 3 by far he never even finished. But anyway, so it sounds like he just got feedback and was like, they're like, nope, it's not The Hobbit. I like it, it's just not The Hobbit.
It brings to mind two thoughts. One is, imagine what we would think about The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings if he had completed the rewrite and we had grown up reading that. It would have felt like basically a 4-book series. Right now, we think about it as The Hobbit, and then The Lord of the Rings as a 3-book series. And everyone, of course, knows that The Hobbit is the prequel to The Lord of the Rings, but with the style similarities, it would be basically like a 4-book series instead of what it ended up being. And the second thing it tells me is that if that's indeed the reason, if his son Christopher is right, and who am I to naysay that, then Tolkien must have found some deep value in the children's story versus just writing a more accurate prequel to Lord of the Rings. And there must have been some value in his head for that, and that dissuaded him from completing the task. So that's my theory.
Yeah, and if the feedback wasn't like, this is wonderful, I can't wait to see how the entire story shifts into this style, rather than it's not The Hobbit, I can imagine that he would have thought like, what are the people who love The Hobbit gonna think once they read this? Like, will this now feel like just like a completely different story? Because to him it was the same story, he was just writing it more correctly. Like it was George Lucas once that said movies are never finished, they're just released. And that's kind of the way that it feels like, Tolkien looks at his stories, right? The story is never finished, they're just published at some point.
Yeah.
In the middle of it.
Tolkien was really, he was much more explicit about that too, that he was always discovering more of the story.
Yeah.
It was an art form of discovery to him, not just I've done a work and the book is done and now there's nothing more to say. For him, it was always the world opening itself up more and more to him, and him capturing it, or remembering it, or discovering it more accurately.
It's sort of like in one of his letters, he talked about discovering Aragorn. Like he didn't know who that was originally when he put it in the Lord of the Rings, and then he discovered who he was,
Right.
As he progressed through the story.
Yep.
Yeah, wonderful. All right, guys, that's our take. So overall, okay, before we jump into our extended podcast, overall, what would you say about the quality? Number one, the quality of this versus the quality of The Hobbit. Like, do you like the style better? 2, do you wish he would have finished it? Or do you wish he would have finished this entire rewrite? Or are you satisfied with the version of The Hobbit that we have? And 3, would this have made a better story? Like, do you think it's told better? So 1.
So I think I'll answer 3 first. I think that I wish at the age that I am, and with my appreciation for Tolkien being what it is, I wish he had finished the version. Now, why? Because the way he was writing these first 2.5 chapters, he was unfolding his world in greater detail. And I love Tolkien's world, and I want to know more about Middle-earth, and I invariably would know more about Middle-earth and some of its richness in the detail that he would have put in the following chapters. For example, just to take one tiny example, I am convinced that we would know much more about Dane Ironfoot and much more about Smaug and dragons and how they came about and their history once he got to those chapters. You know, the history of that part of the world, the northern part of the world, and its legends and its the struggles between the goblins, Gundabad, and the Withered Heath, and all of that area, and the dwarves struggle and the men. I mean, we would just learn so much.
Yeah.
And I miss that. I miss a thing that doesn't exist. So I wish he would have finished it. However, to go back to my earlier point, if he had finished it, it would have been an extension of Lord of the Rings. So you would have had one story. With The Hobbit as it exists right now, I feel we have 2 related stories, not one story. And that the story of Bilbo and his adventure with the dwarves, and to free their home from a dragon, and the way it's told as a children's story, I feel that has there's something very special about that. And I admit that much of my experience of it has to do with what I see reflected in my own children's eyes, because I read The Hobbit every 3 or 4 years to them as a new batch grows into it. And so it's just The Hobbit has a special place in their children's hearts and childlike hearts, and so I see it as a different kind of story, even though of course it's related. So there's my somewhat nuanced answer. Well,
I certainly wish he would have finished it. I do like it better, like my selfish adult self, like you said. I enjoy the world creation and the expert prose writer he became. Through writing The Lord of the Rings, and we missed out on that more. I mean, it's still disappointing that all we get really published from him in his life as a story, as a true, complete adult story, is The Lord of the Rings. That's all we got.
Yep, and he really, but also we see, like from the passage that you and I talked about last week, the real difference in how he honed his craft, just in his description of Elrond between the 2 books, and it just really, he really became a better writer in that period of time.
He did. But here's the thing about that, like you were saying. I feel like The Hobbit is kind of the gateway drug. It's really easy to jump into The Hobbit as a young child and go like, what a fun story. I love this as a kid, right? A lot of people say that, and they read The Hobbit first, and then they get to The Lord of the Rings, even when they're a little bit older, and they find that they love that just as much and probably more. And so there's something about the charm of The Hobbit, the children's approach that he took, that does lend itself to being a wonderful story to share with your kids. Whereas if it was older, if it was more like Lord of the Rings, it's a lot harder to share that with a 7 or 8 year old. For most 7 or 8 year olds, unlike your precocious ones, Michael. So yeah, I wish he would have finished it, but I think I'm happy he didn't.
Right.
And perhaps because he didn't finish it, he got to spend more time in the Silmarillion and finish stories like the Children of Húrin and the Fall of Gondolin.
What a difference the Children of Húrin and the Hobbit make, eh?
Yeah, and then remember, guys, once we finish the Hobbit, we are going to go into the Children of Húrin and read that. Take the
be prepared to be sad, very very
All right.
sad.
All right, we're going to get into our extended podcast. We're going to talk about what is the least Lord of the Rings like event that we can find in the Hobbit after rereading through this here and how Tolkien might have dealt with it. So join us there. Go to theonering.com/member to get that. It's $4 a month. First month is free. If you just want to hear our thoughts about it this month, just become a member and then cancel. That's all you got to do, and you won't get charged. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you next week as we get into chapter 4. We'll probably do about half of chapter 4 next week too. I'm not sure where we're gonna stop, but that's what we'll do. Catch you then.
Take care, freeloaders. Bye-bye.